All right, welcome back. We are going to finish looking at chapter 12 today. I'm actually going to make two videos. I'm going to make the Revolutions of 1848, which is located in chapter 13, its own separate video, so as not to confuse these sorts of things. So when we had last talked, we talked about how a conservative order descends upon Europe following the Congress of Vienna. But there will be challenges to that in the forms of liberalism, nationalism, and also the colonial independence movements that we see in the New World. Before 1830, the conservative order is really able to kind of parlay and fend these things off, but there are going to be challenges, and that's what we're going to look at today is like the earliest challenges to the conservative order. Obviously, the greatest challenge will be the revolutions of 1848, although they will end up being spectacular failures and actually result in the greater consolidation of power by conservative regimes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's take a look at the reading guide that I had made for you for this, which is over pages 447 to 456. So the first thing we have to talk about is the Ottoman Empire. And that is what is being referred to in or with the phrase the Eastern Question. So the Ottoman Empire has been this long-standing force in the Eastern Mediterranean. It is a Muslim empire that was oftentimes the scourge of Christian Europe. We've talked about how Ottoman expansion played roles in allowing Luther greater reign during the Reformation because the Holy Roman Emperor was concerned with Ottoman expansion. We've talked about the Ottoman Empire when we discussed European exploration. One of the reasons why they sailed west was they were looking to break the monopoly that Muslim merchants had in the Eastern Mediterranean because of the Ottoman Empire. We talked about, various wars like Philip II of Spain led excursions against the Muslim Ottoman Empire. So they've been around for a long time. But by the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire is an empire in decline. Now, nobody knows this in, let's say, 1820, but we know because we have the history of hindsight that this is the end of the Ottoman Empire. We are seeing the beginning of the end. It's going to be a long, slow decline. The Ottoman Empire will continue to exist in some way, shape, or form up until World War I, where it will find itself defeated. Much of its land will be then divided amongst the Allied victors, and the nation state of Turkey will emerge out of the carcass, if you will, of the Ottoman Empire. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. By the 1820s, the Ottoman Empire is in decline, and it's not able to control the territories that it had once controlled very easily. And this is going to be especially problematic in the Balkans, which is the area in southeast, Europe. So I have a map here. Let's see if I can pull it up. All right, so as you can see right here, the title of this map is Dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, 1807 to 1924. That's really the story of the Ottoman Empire all throughout the 19th century. And it is this area right here that I am encircling that is going to be most problematic. This is the Balkans. And we will see new nations emerge in the Balkans that will upset the balance of power that the Congress of Vienna had sought to create. And so two nations emerge in the early 19th century. We have the emergence of an independent Greece in 1821, I believe. And then we have the creation of an independent Serbia in 1830. So let's look at Greece first. So the Greeks are going to break away from the Ottoman Empire, and they have a lot of help from European liberals who sort of rally around the idea of an independent Greece. You know, liberals with their dreams of representative government and democracy are going to look at Greece as the ancestral home of these ideas. And so it is this romantic cause for many liberals that Greece should gain their independence. And so many Europeans, although it threatens the balance of power that the Congress of Vienna had established, can't help themselves. They want to see the establishment of Greece for sort of emotional reasons. And additionally, don't ever forget the European Islamophobia, right? The fear of Islam and its hatred amongst Europeans is a powerful influence here as well. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to get tied up into this Eastern question, right? What should we do about the declining Ottoman Empire? Should we prop it up and support it because it maintains a balance of power, or should we take advantage of what's going on and allow for new states to emerge? What about the question of Christianity? All these populations here are Christian groups. You know, the Greeks are mostly Orthodox, as are the Serbs, but there's going to be Catholics in there as well. What do we do about that? Should we allow them to be under the control of a Muslim government that treats them as second-class citizens? Or should we support their independence movement? Further complicating matters, Russia has always had territorial designs on Ottoman lands. Their weakening makes Russia more powerful. Is that something you want to have happen if you're a European power? Austria-Hungary is very sensitive to nationalist demands. So any nationalist demands that are satisfied in the Balkans pose a direct threat to them. Austria and Russia are going to have a rivalry over this. Britain and France are going to be uneasy about a growing Russian influence in the Mediterranean. There are a whole bunch of consequences and things that are going to have to be dealt with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, it's going to lead to a war known as the Crimean War. Okay, let's get to actual Greece independence now. So basically, the forces of Europe are going to come to the aid of their Christian ally against their Muslim enemy, and they're going to support Greek independence, even though it's kind of counter to their balance of power concepts that they talked about. We are going to see Russia come in and occupy land over here, as you can see. Greece is going to gain its independence, and they are going to declare Otto I of Bavaria, which is an area in southern Germany, way over here, as the first king of Greece. Now, this is a great example. Many liberals had supported the independence of Greece because they thought it would become a democracy, but instead it becomes a monarchy, and the ruler of Greece is not Greek himself, he's a Bavarian prince. This is an example of the concept of legitimate monarchy being formed through legal treaties and not a reflection of the will of the people and popular sovereignty and things like that. So the independence of Greece, although it is going to be made because of nationalist passions, is also in a sense conservative in how it is created. Now, Serbia is going to be the same sort of thing that we see. The Serbians are Slavic Christian peoples who are going to very much not like being a minority group within a Turkish Muslim-dominated empire, and so they often rebel. And eventually, this is going to create a really strong nationalist feeling amongst Serbian people. So in 1830, we are going to see that Serbia is going to gain their independence, and you can see where their autonomy is given in 1830. The problem with this is that there are going to be Serbians living outside of the borders of Serbia. If you are familiar with the outbreak of World War I, you know where this is heading. But basically, the Serbians are going to fight like heck against the Ottoman Empire, but once they get their independence, they're going to turn their attention to fighting like heck against the Austrian Empire, which has Serbian people within its borders. Serbia, infused with nationalism, is going to say all Serbs under Serb rule, and that is going to lead to a problem. Further complicating this is that Serbs are Slavic Orthodox, which is what Russia is as well. And so there's going to be a kinship amongst those two groups. And so this Serbian nationalism that will bring in the great powers of Austria and Russia, that right there is the crux of World War I's outbreak. And so we are definitely going to return to this area of the world. It poses major problems for European peace and relationships and things like that. But for this test, all we need to know really is that the Ottoman Empire is in decline and is incapable of hanging onto their territories. And so we see the emergence of two new nations within the Balkans, with more to come, and the potential for great danger because of the rivalry between Austria and Russia as well. Okay, let's move on to Russia. So in Russia in 1825, there is something known as the Decembrist Revolt. Now, this is going to be a failure, and the effect of it is going to be a more repressive, more autocratic Russia. But let's talk about the events that lead to it. So during the Napoleonic Wars, Russian forces are going to play a big role in the defeat of Napoleon. And Russian units are going to be stationed in Paris while the Congress of Vienna is being negotiated, while they're trying to figure out what they're going to do exactly. Many Russian officers are going to see the liberal reforms and just how different France is from the old-fashioned, traditionally bound Russia, and they're going to say to themselves, man, we need to make some serious changes in Russia. These reforms that the French have instituted during the revolution are really good. And so what we are going to see is that Russia, after the Congress of Vienna, is very, very conservative. Alexander I is the leader of the Concert of Europe. He was the one who wanted to maintain a conservative order in Europe, and that's going to create unrest within his kingdom. Now, this unrest is not able to be verbalized out loud. We're going to see the formation of secret societies. And these secret societies will exist amongst certain members of the military, and they will call for Western-style liberal reforms. But because Russia is so repressive and conservative, it has to be underground. This is secret, right? This is plotting and not doing it out in the open. And so they're going to call for a variety of reforms. They're going to call for a loosening of censorship and a freedom of speech. They're going to call for the abolition of serfdom, which is probably the biggest issue. They are going to call for representative government constitutional rule, you know, your garden variety liberal reforms. This is unthinkable in Tsarist Russia. Alexander I dies, and there is controversy about who's supposed to take over. He basically has two brothers, and one of the brothers doesn't want the job, but he's very popular. The other brother wants the job, but is not very popular. The unpopular brother, Nicholas I, is the one who eventually takes over. At the ceremony where the Tsar is inaugurated, for lack of a better term, the military performs this ritual where they acknowledge the new Tsar and pledge allegiance to him. Well, one of the army regiments, for lack of a better term, refuses to pledge allegiance to the Tsar. They are staging basically a coup calling for liberal reforms and trying to force them upon the Tsar. Now, he is going to call in other parts of the army who is going to put this coup down. This is what will be known as the Decembrist Revolt. So it's an utter failure. It doesn't result in any changes whatsoever, but the ideas that they promote are going to capture the imagination of some Russian people, particularly the idea of the abolition of serfdom and the creation of a constitutional government. The very few Russian liberals that do exist in the shadows are going to cling to these hopes. They are never going to be realized, but they're going to cling to them. So when Nicholas takes over, he is very much upset by the Decembrist Revolt, and he is going to answer this liberal action with greater repression and conservatism and autocracy that will become symbolic of what Russia is going to look like in the 19th century. Nicholas is going to refuse for any reforms that need to be done, even reforms that he himself realizes is necessary. There's a quote in the first full paragraph of page 451 where basically he talks about the need for reform to happen, but that it just is impossible to do. And so Nicholas is not a foolish man. He certainly realizes that the abolition of serfdom is probably in the long-term interest of Russia. It just would upset the system too much. It would be too radical a departure from tradition that he's afraid of what the repercussions of that would be, even if it would be a net positive over time. Nicholas is going to increase censorship and use of the secret police, and he is going to promote a policy known as official nationality. So official nationality is basically a three-pronged policy statement of what it means to be Russian, right? Number one, the promotion and embracing of the Orthodox Church, right? That Russia is a Christian nation, that the Orthodox Church is a pillar of Russian society and stability, that the Orthodox Church is the It's an arm of government. It's going to support the policies of the czar and say and teach that these are the will of God. It is going to control the schooling that goes on and teaching people what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And it is going to tell people that the world exists as is because that is God's will. And so if you are born a serf, that is God's will. Social revolution is a sin, right? And so basically the church is going to be used to reinforce all the conservative features of life that we see in Russia. That's the first part of official nationality. The second part is going to be the czar himself. Autocracy is the basis of Russian existence, that you need a strong hand to guide the Russian ship, if you will, and that there is not going to be any constitutional creations, that there is not going to be any representative government. There is the czar, he is in charge, everyone is loyal to him. Absolute monarchy is absolutely, forgive my pun, the way to go. And then number three, Russia is a multinational empire with many national groups who are not Russian. And they are going to say to those other groups that basically you need to embrace Russian culture. That Russian culture, its religion, the Orthodox Christian version of that, its history, its language are the foundations of a stable society that make it better than other places in Europe. Look at Western Europe with all their liberalism and revolution and disorder and instability. Do you want to be like that? Of course not, right? And so you need to embrace these three pillars: the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russian autocracy under the Tsar, and the Russian cultural identity. So this is going to be bad for Polish or Lithuanian or Jews or whomever else is living within Russia. If you are not Russian, you're going to be treated as a second-class citizen. They are not addressing any of the nationalist claims. They are shutting those things down. So very conservative policies here by Nicholas, as you can see. And these are reactions against the Decembrist revolt and also just a continuation of Russian tradition, right? Russia has always been this conservative, traditional, if you want to be judgmental, you could say backwards society amongst the Europeans. While everyone else in Europe in the 19th century is going to liberalize and become democracies and industrialize and urbanize, Russia is going to remain an agrarian, serfed society with an autocratic government. It is going to look like a time machine, like they live in a time warp by 1900. They don't do any of the changes, and a lot of that can be placed at the feet of Nicholas I. Now, for those of you who know a little bit about Russia, there will be some attempts to reform. We will see the abolition of serfdom. It is not nearly as liberal as that sounds. We shall get to that. So just place a pin in that. That will be in chapter 14. Okay, we are going to talk about Poland in a little bit, but Poland is tied into the events in France. So let's move to France. Now, if you're confused as to how France affects Poland, hopefully you will see. But let me just say real quickly, as politically conservative domestically as Nicholas I is, he's just as conservative when it comes to foreign policy. And so movements by the Polish inspired by a French Revolution in 1830 will be squashed. Okay, so let's make sure we've covered everything here so far. We've gotten to the Decembrist revolt, the long-lasting impact. I didn't type this in, but it's basically repression and autocracy and doubling down on conservative things. And we will talk about all these things, but basically he resists any reforms or changes whatsoever. So let's move on to France. So France is different than other places that we have talked about. They started the revolution, and their government, although conservative after the Congress of Vienna, less conservative than other places. Louis XVIII, as we had talked about, had allowed for a constitutional monarchy, some suffrage, a charter, although he is going to say, although I give you this constitution, it is still a constitution. And there are various protections and civil liberties and things like that. Louis XVIII dies in 1824, and his brother Charles X, the Duc d'Artois, is going to take over. Charles X is a very conservative monarch, and he is going to be a lightning rod for criticism from his liberal and radical adversaries. And eventually his reign is going to be ended by a revolution that results in the end of the Bourbon line forever. and the rise of a new monarchy in France. So let's get to that, shall we? So Charles X takes over, and he is very much an ultra-royalist, and he believes in divine right. Here we go again, right? These French monarchs and their claims of divine right power never ends well for them. So one of the first things he's going to do when he becomes king is he's going to say, hey, you know all that land that the church and the aristocracy lost in the revolution? That was really unfair. And we need to indemnify the people who lost. Basically, he is going to give money to people to pay them for the land that they had seized from them. Now, this is very unpopular with his liberal opponents within the French Legislative Assembly. He is also going to bring back old-fashioned ideas like primogeniture, that the firstborn son inherits all the property of the father, and he is going to pass harsh penalties for people who are guilty of sacrilege, which is, limiting freedom of religion and certainly protecting the Roman Catholic Church. So what he is attempting to do in the eyes of many of his critics is roll back the revolution, bring back old regime-style policies to modern-day France. Now, this is going to bring opposition to him, and we will see liberal candidates will run for elections for the Chamber of Deputies, which is a part of the French Legislative Assembly, and in 1827, they will win a majority of the seats and force compromises. But these liberal demands are going to be mostly unsatisfied. Again, in 1830, another election brings a big win for the liberal opponents of Charles X. And this is where Charles X decides to get sneaky. So in 1830, Charles is going to lose this election. Liberal politicians will gain seats in the Chamber of Deputies, and there is this belief that they are going to force Charles to compromise and undo some of his more conservative policies. And so Charles is basically going to stage a political coup. He's going to try to undo the results of that election. He is going to launch an invasion of Algeria, and that military campaign will go very well for the French. The French are going to invade Algeria and basically seize it and take it over. And Algeria will remain a part of the French Empire up until 1962. The book The Stranger that we are going to read in class in May is going to take place in French Algeria. Anyway, Charles believes that the great military success the French military has won in Algeria is going to give him cover to undo a lot of the things that the liberal opponents of his have attempted to do. So in the euphoria of the win, Charles is going to release a series of laws. And these laws are going to do many things, like restrict the press, dissolve the Chamber of Deputies that was just elected in the election of 1830, limit the vote to only the ultra-rich people within society, and then call for new elections, which under the new rules of society are going to be dominated by conservative factions. Now, this action is transparent in its grab for power, and it excites great protests. Now, Charles, like a Scooby-Doo villain, might have been able to get away with it, but he didn't plan accordingly. He didn't have enough troops stationed in Paris, which massive protests are going to break out, and there's not enough troops to put down the protests and the barricades that get erected, and eventually the violence that the liberal opposition drums up is going to drive Charles X from power. Now, there's going to be a problem with the liberals and their tactics of using the working class for their political goals, but let's stick a pin in that. Charles is going to have to abdicate. He is going to go live in exile the rest of his life, and this represents the end of the Bourbons. And as you can see, I wrote one of the effects of this is that the Bourbons are going to be removed from power again, because this is the third time they've been removed from power, Louis XVI. And then the Bourbons come back, but then Napoleon does his 100 days and they have to leave again. And so this is the third removal for the Bourbons. This is the end. We'll never see another Bourbon on the throne. So, a moment of silence for our Bourbon homies. They're done. So basically, liberal leaders have overthrown a king, and what they are going to do is they're going to turn to the cousin of the Bourbons, from the Orleans family. Louis Philippe is going to become the new king of France, but he is going to agree to a much more liberal regime than what Charles X had. So what we are going to see is what's known as the July Revolution take place. The July Revolution of 1830 is the removal of Charles X and the rise of Louis Philippe, head of the Orleans family, to be the new monarchy. So sometimes you see this period known as the July Revolution or the Orleans monarchy or the liberal monarchy. All of those terms are synonyms for what we are talking about here. Now, it is interesting to note that the political violence that got rid of Charles X was instigated by liberal politicians using working class Frenchmen as the muscle on the streets. But the working class don't get anything from this. They don't get a democracy. They don't get any addressing of the social question. And this is going to be a long-term problem that liberals are going to encounter. When liberal politicians resist conservative regimes, they often turn to working class individuals to be the muscle on the streets to help them force their, to flex their muscles, if you will. But the liberal politicians, with their goals of limited suffrage and laissez-faire economic policies, don't offer any sort of compromise or any policy initiatives for their working class allies. And what we will see is that these alliances will often fall apart. We're going to talk about this more when we get to the revolutions of 1848. So, July of 1830, we have the creation of a new monarchy in France. Louis Philippe becomes the new French monarchy. This is known as the July monarchy or the Orleans monarchy, as I said. He is going to appoint as his chief minister Francois Guizot, and Guizot is going to be famous for the phrase, enrich yourself. He is going to allow for the bourgeois segment of society to enact laissez-faire policies and to grow wealthy. What we are going to see is the creation of a new French aristocracy, basically. No longer is it an aristocracy of birth, it will be an aristocracy of wealth. Those who own property will dominate the political institutions, and they will recreate society in their image, right? So basically, we're going to see constitutional monarchy with protection of civil liberties. We are going to see representative government, but who's represented? Only the wealthy and property owners, not extended to the working class, not extended to the poor. It is classic liberalism that we are seeing at play here. We are also going to see the implementation of laissez-faire, free market, capitalist principles, whatever you want to call it. So, some other changes that we see showing the true liberal nature. He is going to be the king of the French. That's the term that Louis Philippe will use to describe himself, not the king of France, right? The king of the French, like he's the chosen ruler of the French people. The tricolor revolutionary flag becomes the official flag of France. That's the modern French flag, the red, white, and blue. We are going to see much more liberal institutions and things like that than under Charles X. However, Louis Philippe is not a friend of the working class. We are going to see that worker tension and working class disorder is a continual problem during his, I almost said presidency, during his monarchy. We are going to see that the government is going to pass repressive issues, particularly when it comes to social and economic issues and protests that arise from that. And so this is a very liberal monarchy. That's the key thing to remember. And it will last until 1848 when it is overthrown at what will be the beginning of the revolutions of 1848. But we'll come back to that. Now, much like the French Revolution of 1789, the French Revolution of 1830 reverberates throughout France, or Europe, excuse me. There are going to be consequences in other places. Two places will be shocked with violence and turnover. The first one we are to talk about is Poland. Polish nationalists will be inspired by the French Revolution of 1830. They will seek to make demands on Nicholas I, like the French did with Charles X. Nicholas will send in Russian forces and crush this. And so the Great Russian Fear, as revolution in one place can spread to other places, comes home to roost. We see it in Poland, but the Polish nationalist goals are crushed by Russian forces, Poland will be an integral part of the Russian Empire. That is the official stance of the Russian Tsar. Now, the other place where we see reverberations from 1830 is going to be in Belgium. Basically, the Belgians don't like being part of a larger Netherlands. They speak different languages and they practice different religions. The Netherlands is more Calvinist and they speak Dutch. The Belgians speak French and are Catholic. And so what we are going to see is that when news of what has happened to Charles X hits Belgium, Belgian nationalists, inspired by an opera, that is not a misstatement that I made, are going to basically rebel against their Dutch rulers and demand independence. Now, Belgium and the Netherlands had been fused together by the Congress of Vienna, and so in theory, this should be something that is ignored, or not ignored, put down by the great powers. However, Russia, preoccupied with Poland and more worried about what's going on over there. France wants an independent Belgium. They think, ooh, that's easier for us to manipulate and take control of. And Great Britain will support Belgian neutrality. If Belgium is allowed to exist, they will have a treaty that will say that Belgium gets to be independent, and anyone that messes with it also messes with Britain. And so the Belgians, inspired by the revolution of 1830 in France, gained their independence. And Belgian neutrality is part of the official agreement, meaning that Belgium cannot be occupied by another European power. Now, for those of you who know anything about World War I, Germany will violate Belgian neutrality, and that is what actually brings Britain into the war. So in 1830, the emergence of Serbia and the emergence of Belgium are going to have impacts into the 20th century, as we shall see. Okay, so that is the end of France. So now we're going to move on to Great Britain. So in Great Britain in the 1830s, the conservative government that's in charge there is going to do what the British always do, and that is make incremental reforms without the need for social revolution to take place. The British political institutions, ever since 1689 and the Glorious Revolution, have allowed for small incremental change to take place that prevents the need for any French revolutionary style actions from happening. And that is what we are going to see in the 1830s. And we'll see it in two real places. The Great Reform Bill of 1832 will be passed, which will give greater political say to the bourgeoisie inside of England. And also there will be a placating of Irish nationalism involving the Roman Catholic Church and representation in Parliament. So let's talk about what's going on in Great Britain. So basically, when last we talked about Great Britain, they were cracking down on working class unrest. They had passed the Six Acts, which had prohibited large public gatherings and had instituted some censorship on working class type peoples. Now, Britain is different from most other places in Europe. They have industrialized faster and urbanized more rapidly than other places. And so they have a larger bourgeoisie. Their commercial and industrial class is bigger and wealthier, and the British aristocrats who control Parliament are going to find that it is not going to be feasible, to ignore their demands. Now remember, the English Parliament is very conservative. They had passed the Corn Laws, which had artificially increased the price of grain. And so the aristocrats in Britain are firmly in control. But what they are going to do in the 1830s, after the French Revolution of 1830, they see what happens to Charles X. And the British aristocrats are going to say, there's a lot of turmoil in society, and we don't want this to happen here. So let's give the bourgeoisie some greater rights and participation to stave off revolution. And that will be the Great Reform Bill of 1832. So basically, what the Great Reform Bill of 1832 does is, in a non-specific way, it gives the bourgeoisie in society, the commercial and industrial leaders, more of a say in government. It gives them the right to vote, and it gives them representation in Parliament. Now, how representation was apportioned in Parliament was all messed up. It reflected the living patterns of Britain before the Industrial Revolution. And so there will be these big, huge rural estates that have very little population that will have 2 members represent that particular district in parliament. These will be known as rotten boroughs. They are representative districts that don't actually reflect where people are living. They are mostly empty, hence the term rotten. And then you have entire cities that have sprung up that have no representation whatsoever because they didn't exist back in the day when parliament representation was drawn up. And so these big cities with huge populations have no representation. And so basically, parliament is too rural, it is too aristocratic. And this is causing great consternation amongst the urban dwelling bourgeoisie. And so the Great Reform Bill fixes that. They give representation to the newly formed towns, and they take away some of the representatives that had been residing in these rotten bureaus where they didn't have people actually living. So something like 57 rural districts are wiped off the map. Another 31 are reduced from having 2 representatives in parliament to 1, and then the cities get new representation. And this is going to be a very British thing that we will see. Oftentimes, conservative forces in government will use liberal reforms not to liberalize the country necessarily, but to placate groups and allow for incremental reform and change to take place without upsetting too much of the apple cart. There's also going to be steps made to placate the Irish. The Irish are a part of Great Britain, and they are allowed representation in Parliament. The only problem is that in a nod to the past religious tensions, only members of the Anglican Church or other Protestants are allowed to serve in Parliament. The vast majority of people in Ireland are Catholic, and they want to have Catholic representatives in Parliament, but that is against the law. And so, much like the Great Reform Bill, Parliament will pass the Catholic Emancipation Act, which essentially says that Catholics are now allowed to participate in Parliament. And so this is done to placate the Irish. Now, it is not going to be the only issue we see with Ireland and the British, but for the 1830s, it sort of cools the room. It cools the temperature of, the unrest that is being felt. And so a key thing here is that Britain is not a full democracy yet. They have not passed universal suffrage. They have only granted greater suffrage to the uppermost levels of property owners within society. So it's very similar to the government of Louis Philippe as well. And so conservatives are facing nationalist and liberal challenges, and they are maintaining their power. It just depends on what we're talking about here. The only place where you could say they couldn't would be France, but even in France, the changes that happen only happen because Charles X is so inflexible and so ultra-royalist that he gets removed from power, but they don't create a republic. They don't give universal male suffrage. It just becomes a more liberal constitutional monarchy. Okay, so that's it for chapter 12. So basically what we've looked at is the conservative order in Europe after the Congress of Vienna up to 1848. Now, the next video I make is going to deal with the revolutions of 1848. As you will see, there will be great challenges to the conservative order, but ultimately these revolutions will fail, and the conservatives who are in power will remain in power. Okay, so look forward to that next video. It should be released in a little bit. We'll talk more later.